Okay. Yeah, my name's Cory McArthur. I'm a user experience engineer for SWRKit. What that means is basically I design and develop for them. I started at SWRKit in September, and it's been awesome. Just been working from home. SWRKit's a remote team, so we got a guy that works in London, a guy in Missouri, and all over the U.S. And we went to the Ionic headquarters to kick off our rewrite in February. So we were at Ionic working with the team as they are still working on Ionic 4. So I've been working with their team really closely as we've encountered bugs as they're trying to upgrade their whole system and stuff. So it's been really fun to see that happen. And there we go. So today, rather than do a presentation, we're going to do a live coding thing. So if anyone wants to keep up, I actually think we could do this if you want to. I have a big to-do list here on the right in lieu of slides, and if I could zoom in on this, really good. Basically, what we want to do is we're going to start out with a stencil app. They have a couple stencil starters. We're going to replace some of the stencil components with Ionic 4 components. Has any of you guys used Stencil before or used Stencil? No? Heard of Stencil? Raise your hand if you've heard of Stencil. Okay. So Stencil is a web components compiler. I heard this guy over here talk about Polymer. Polymer is similar in their jobs. They're basically, Stencil, you write them in TSX. They're in TypeScript, JavaScript mixture, kind of like you do in React. And it compiles all of your components into basically web compliant or web standards based web components. So anything you write in TSX then comes out as pure JavaScript in a component, basically in a web component way. And they can be used with any framework because they are just web components. So Ionic 4 is meant to be framework agnostic. You can use React, you can use Angular, you can use Stencil if you want. They're not really pushing that, but that's actually the way we're doing it with SWRKit. We're actually going to write it using Stencil as the main framework, or you could just use plain JavaScript. So it's pretty awesome. So to start, these are the three things that I've done before we started, besides going through this whole thing. So I have gone through this once, so it does work. But we're going to pick up from right here. So I've cloned the Ionic repo that they have. If you guys have seen this demo in GitHub, it's basically, what am I missing? There you go, Ionic PWA. So the Ionic PWA toolkit is a repo that they update pretty regularly. In fact, Justin just said that he's going to update it soon to include Ionic 4. So these first steps that we're going to go through will likely be in the repo next week. So that's all I've done. I've cloned it, I've installed the dependencies, and I've done an npm start. So npm start will then serve up any of the changes. Where are we going? And the structure here, you can see this all right. Inside of a project that is built with Stencil is we have components, and all of your top-level components will go here. There's a global CSS file where they're starting to use CSS variables a lot, so they might declare variables in here. And then each of your components will have a Sass file, if you choose to use Sass. I've chosen to use Sass here. A spec, so if you want to do unit tests, you can do that as well. And then a TSX file. Inside your TSX here, there is, if you're familiar with React, this will look very familiar, well, somewhat familiar to you. There's your class name, which will be your component. There's properties and state. And then inside this, because this is TSX, you actually return DOM. So here's what my template is going to be rendered out. Feel free to interrupt me as we go, because I know a lot of you guys haven't heard of Stencil before. Yeah.
What's the difference between TSX and JSX?
So TSX is TypeScript. So it's JSX, but with TypeScript. So you get the benefits of using types and typings, and I will show you some of those benefits as we do it here, but it'll reduce a lot of problems and stuff while coding. Yes. Any other questions? Okay. So here's the demo that we have. Let me zoom in on this one too. The demo that this is just Stencil so far, so it's serving up just web components, and the web components are reacting to data that is being passed to it. So when I go to the profile page, this is a parameter that's being passed in, the name Stencil. So if I type in Cory, you'll see my name is Cory, right? So it's reacting to the parameters being passed to it. And this is all through Stencil's router currently. But you notice, like, as I navigate around here, Stencil basically does like you see a flash in between each of them, right? And if you're used to Ionic, there's always smooth transitions between each of your pages, right? So that's the first thing we're going to do. We're going to replace Stencil's router with the Ionic router. And this is new as of like a few weeks ago. So one of the tricks I wanted to show you was if you go into your, I just figured this out like 2 weeks ago. That's why I wanted to show some of these things. If I want to know what the latest version of some code is, an NPM module, well, latest version of an NPM module, even if it's not like published as a stable version, I can run npm show Ionic core, and when I do that, I get a lot of information back from npm, and this right here will tell me what their latest version is. And this is the latest one that got pushed today, 1.4, so that's the one we're going to be using. But these dashes are all pre-releases, so I've been working with the pre-release version. Each day I come in and I check which one they're currently on, and start out my day on the latest version, and then if I run any bugs, I'll Slack the team. So that's the version I'm going to use. So I'll now run an npm install of Ionic core at 0.1.4. And we're also going to do Stencil core. So Stencil is updated as well to 0.7.5, which I think they'll update the GitHub repo soon.
This is all client-side code, right?
This is client-side, yes.
Just checking, sorry.
But you can. I'm no back-end developer, but they have talked about server-side rendering, stuff like that, so you could serve up.
I didn't know you could route URLs.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so I've installed those two dependencies. First step we're going to do is we're going to replace the Stencil router with Ion router. So if I go to my app TSX file, they have a lot of stuff in this component did load. Stencil has a few lifecycle methods that you can tie into, just like React. They're just named a little differently. Component will load will happen before anything renders on the page, and it will actually prevent it from rendering on the page. So you want to use component will load very sparingly because you don't want nothing to happen, right?
It's like the ng init on init, right? That's what it compares to for those that know Angular.
I probably.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah, so
I'm not
it's similar
sure
to
when
the.
init happens,
There's Angular lifecycle hooks like on init and yeah.
Yeah, I know Ionic
Unload.
has some like on view enter, on view will enter, right?
Yeah.
The difference here is that, well, it's probably the same thing. Init actually prevents anything from like rendering on the page. Is that right?
Yeah.
And the same thing happens here. So you don't want to put any like network requests in a will load because your user will hit a button, nothing will happen until the request comes back, and then it'll show up. So they might hit that button 4 times waiting for something to happen. So you want to do most of your stuff inside the component did load. So this first step, instead of using Stencil router, we're going to use Ion router. And lucky for us, we just need to replace these names with Ion routers. And most of the other things stay the same. I do need to import Ionic Core, which is here. That's good. And I'm going to uninstall. I'm going to uninstall the stencil router. Actually, before I do that, let me say this, just to make sure something's still rendered. And sometimes you need to restart your server so that it gets the new modules you've installed and it works the way you want it to. And that time it did work. Okay, cool. So we have the thing rendered. Okay. The stencil router is replaced. And what's going on here is we don't have any place for it to actually render. The Ion router actually works a little differently than Stencil router does. Stencil router does both of them take in a component. However, the Ionic router needs to have it works in conjunction with Ion nav. So unless we have an Ion nav in there, no component. The component doesn't know where to show up. So I'm going to just copy a little bit of code out of here. Well, I didn't do that. So I actually do have an Ion router. So this Ion nav here. I'm going to comment out some of my code here. So now we have an Ion nav. So what I've put in here is an Ion split pane, and the way a split pane works is that there's a menu that's open when you're on a desktop, and I'll show you here. And the menu closes on, the menu is accessible, see that gets, when I'm on a desktop computer, or a wide enough screen really, you could be on a tablet as well, you'll get the menu on the left, and then your view on the right, but then when it closes, the menu's hidden. So we'll add a button here in a second, but you'll be able to toggle that menu open and close. Right, so I have these views now. Now if I try to switch between these pages, nothing happens because, well, I'm getting an error because I still haven't updated my my route on my other component. So if I open up my profile page, these are just default pages that come with the starter. The Ion router, or the stencil router, uses some different parameters than what the Ion router does. It actually makes it a lot easier if anyone has used it before. So rather than putting all this conditional logic in here, I can just return this name. So what I'm going to do, sorry, let me explain this. So on our router component, we have two routes now. One that's our home route that routes to the app home component, right? And then our second route is a profile route that I can actually pass this parameter of name into it. Does that make sense? So inside this app profile route is what I'm looking at here. I've just replaced the match params with just a parameter of name. So now I can use this property of name. And I can just put it down here in my template as this dot name inside our single curlies. And now as I save this guy and save this guy, oh, and now I'm not using it. I can pull this out. And now as I come to this home page, it will render fine. Once I remove one more thing, sorry. On the profile page, they'll update the documentation, but you no longer use an Ion page component. And so it's the
brackets or parentheses.
right now I'm using brackets. So when you're returning JSX, if you're returning more than one DOM element, you're passing back an array of DOM. which I didn't like at first, but it works out because I'll show you what this actually renders as. So if I'm looking at this profile page, in this profile page I have an app profile component you can see here, and inside it, directly inside it, are these two. Now if I wanted to wrap them in a div, I could, but then I have this div that's there for nothing, right? It's just encapsulating these two, the Ion header and the Ion content. Awesome. So our content's there.
Feature just TSX, or is that something in JSX too?
That's a JSX thing as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So JSX, you return DOM within your JavaScript, and so you can return as an array, or you can return as a single element. And if I try to do it without it, right, it'll give me an error. So it'll say, well, if I try to return it as one single object, it'll error out. Say you're trying to return two things. So it's unuser having no side effects. Yeah. Basically, you just got to send it back in an array. Okay, so the DOM's there. For some reason, it's not showing up. There's Cory right there. Oh, there it is. Okay, so there it is. My name is Cory. My name was passed through the route parameter. All right, so if I change this, somebody shout out their name.
Stuart.
Stuart. Thank you. And refresh this page. And now we got Stuart in here, right? So parameters can be passed through the Ion route really easily. But you notice here as we go, it's because I've got some weird, it's because the hash is on there. Is it trying to do hash? Right now I have hash routing, and I actually want to turn that off, so give me a second. I can go to the MyApp component, and inside our router, use hash equal to false. So here's a pitch for TSX. So on any of these components, Stencil actually compiles them and kicks back all of the properties that each of these elements can have. So for example, if you're new to Ionic, you can click this Ion router, and it will tell me what interfaces are available for that router. So I have a base and I have a use hash. So if I can't remember what that property's name is, I can just click on it. I command click on it, and it'll basically take me to the documentation of this component and say these are the properties that you have. Now, obviously that doesn't really tell me what it does or doesn't do, but it at least helps me remember what these properties names are. So it can actually be super helpful when you're trying to develop without having to consult the documentation all the time. Or if you're working on a team, it helps your teammates develop quickly as well. Okay, so now that I have use hash is false, you notice up here I have the hash. If I pull this off now, it will render and everything will work without the hash. Right. Yes, it's routing there. It's just not rendering. Well, it's just not showing it. It's there. It's just not showing it. Hydrated. It's funny. We might maybe just a refresh. Refresh will bring it. That's probably an Ionic, but it'll get fixed soon. Sure. Alrighty, but you'll notice we still don't have transitions, and the router isn't being updated. Ion router. What's the last thing I want to do? Remove router, remove match, use router in Ion app, inside Ion app, magic of TSX. That should be working just fine. Added all that.
You have to rebuild it again, do you?
I might have to do a rebuild again. App home, that might be one of the reasons. So app home should not have an Ion page. So I'm just going to pass back an array of DOM here as well. kicks, we're going to restart this guy. There we go. So now we have beautiful transitions, right? I get a new or something.
Ooh, yeah.
So this is material design, right? Material design, your views slide in and fade, but on an iOS device. So if I load this as an iPad and then we pull it out, my views will slide in, right? So automatically, Ionic gives you those two different design patterns, and they do an awesome job of this. Before working at StoreKit, I worked at Lucid Software in South Jordan as a user experience designer, so I'm very design focused. I love design, and I worked on their mobile team where they were writing iOS and Android. They had a team of iOS developers and a team of Android developers to basically develop the same app on two different platforms. So as I was designing for both teams, I actually referenced the Ionic documentation to see how they translated patterns from iOS to Android, and then used similar patterns. So Ionic does an awesome job of making those patterns easy to follow. Okay, so we have transitions. That's awesome. The demo's going well. Is the demo going well?
Yeah. So just by using the Ionic components and the Ionic router,
Yep.
that you get the
You get the transitions automatically by using the Ion router. Exactly. One thing we're going to do, because we're updating from Stencil to Ionic, is now we have to remove the Stencil route links and replace them with Ion route links. So for any Ion button, it's actually pretty easy. You just add an href, and you can pass it. You can just pass it in your parameters. So now I can click on this button as well once this renders, and it will push me to the profile page, right? And it passes the stencil parameter. And if I tap in Cory, right? So any of these links are. Oh, in fact, sorry, that was a cheater move because I copied and pasted that code. The same thing happens here. So on all of these Ion items, an Ion item, you can simply add an href, and it will also do the same thing. So the Ion nav knows that you just changed routes, and it'll handle the transition for you. So you can add that to Ion item, you can add it to an Ion button, and other things, I'm sure. And you'll notice that our material button, did you see our nice ripple effect that we get there? I love geeking out about these things. Where on iOS you don't have that ripple effect. Okay. It's going. We're moving. Okay, so we've updated that. We're going to add a menu button because you notice when this collapses, we can't access our side menu, right? So I'm going to add this guy. This is something you might have to look up in documentation. You can actually look up a lot of this just in the current documentation and infer how it would work in Ionic 4. In Ionic 1, 2, and 3, if I remember right, Ion button wasn't the thing. You had a button and then you added an attribute of Ion button. Is that how it works? Mm-hmm. One breaking change is that you now have to call it an Ion button because it is a component itself. And in Stencil you have, or not just Stencil, but in web components you have what are called slots. So any component that wraps it, like the toolbar, you can insert subcomponents in infinite number of slots. And so rather than in Ionic 1, 2, 3, you had to add an attribute of like Ion end, I think. Is that right? Or maybe it was just end and start. You now have a slot name. So you have to give it the slot name so that it gets inserted into the Ion toolbar at the right place. So on the home page, I want to insert this button, well, Ion buttons, into the slot of start, which is in the top left. I'm going to do that here, and I'm going to do that on our profile page too. So inside the toolbar, adding an Ion buttons component with the start. And it is there, but I don't think our Ionicons has loaded, so let me restart this guy. And there's our icon. So now I get this nice menu that opens up when I'm on a mobile device, and if I'm bigger, it's automatically open on a desktop. Okay, so let's move. Let's do some Firebase auth now. So we're going to add Firebase to this app. I'm going to run a couple of npm installs. These guys got fast Wi-Fi, so it's going to happen good. It's going to happen quick. If I don't copy my check mark as well. We're going to install Firebase app, Firebase auth, and if we get to it, we'll do Firestore as well. Well, we will get to it. We'll get to Firestore. And we're going to install Firebase Firestore. And I'll add those as import statements on my main app. So just like we import Ionic Core and Stencil Core, I'm also going to import Firebase Firestore.
Firebase and Firestore are, I mean, we could take a week, just talking about the features of that and everything, but if you're not familiar with it, you want to just give them a brief description of.
Yeah, so
I mean, you'll cover the biggest parts.
So Firebase, these guys use Firebase in their app. It was acquired by Google, 2 years ago, I think. So it's awesome. It's stable. They're doing great things with it. It's a real-time database that allows people like me, a person that hates backend and doesn't want to touch backend, and I love UI, to use a database an easy-to-use database. And I can make really easy calls to it, and it's in real time. So anything I change in the database automatically updates on the client side without having to hit refresh. And so we'll show a little demo of that real quick once I connect. But you can go to firebase.com, maybe it does go to firebase.google. But you can create an account for free, and you can do a lot of stuff for free. All the stuff I'm doing today is free. So basically, you install these dependencies. What I'm going to do is initiate our Firebase connection on load. So I'm going to init Firebase, and looks like I copied the whole function. Awesome. So I don't mess my function. I just copied an empty line. All right, let's try that again. So we're going to initialize Firebase, and this is something that these lines of code here, this config. The cool thing about Firebase is, yes, these are my API keys. This guy's laughing over here. This actually isn't a security threat as much as you might think it is, because in Firebase I can add database rules so that you can't access my database without being logged in as a user. So even if you have these credentials, you couldn't do anything with my data unless you logged in through an account. In that case, you're only going to be changing the data in your account that you're logged in with, because I can set up those rules, which we won't go over how to set up those rules today, but it's totally possible. So basically, I initialize this app with this config, and this config is really easy to get. So let me just show you real quick, and I'll give you a preview of what the Firebase dashboard looks like. Whoops, I'm in work it. This is what this database looks like. So if I go to my authentication page, I can go to
top right, web setup. It was on the first tab.
This guy. Okay, sorry, what?
Go back one. Yeah, right there. Oh no.
So
I saw there was a button on the top right that said
it's
web setup.
Right, so if you go to add Firebase to your web app, you just copy this right here. It'll tell you the setups. So it gives you all of the API keys and domain that you need to use, right? So it's really easy to do that. So I can even just copy from here and paste it in here. But they're putting it in the head, so they got a script tag and stuff. Where I'm putting it inside my app. The next line that I do here is I'm subscribing basically to an auth state changed. So if somebody, okay, so you'll notice here in my console, maybe, have we reloaded? Maybe I've got to kill it again. Usually every time I add a dependency like Firebase, I just restart so that everything can compile and then not run into issues like that. I didn't actually, so I created the function, but I never called it. So inside component did load, I'm just going to add it here, this dot init Firebase. Now that I initialize Firebase, we will see this console log of whether I am logged in or not. So there it is, user auth is null, so I'm not logged in. Okay, so let's create a login page. How much time do we have? We're making good time. Okay, another pitch for Stencil community is awesome. Because Stencil is still new and Ionic 4 is new, they haven't created the awesome terminal tools to build things with it yet. So one of the community guys just built his own NPM module called STCC. So it's a stencil component builder. So I just call that guy, and I'm going to create a login page. And it is not a shadow component. And I'm going to use Sass because all my other ones do. And right now I don't care for a test file. But you'll notice there's my login page now. So I have a login page, and it gives me the basics. It gives me a component with 2 properties. And if let's do this. If I go to my app home, I need to add that route to my, not add route, sorry. Go to my app, and I want to add that route. We're going to add a new route for the login page. Login. And it's not going to have any parameters. So I don't need them yet. And we're just going to call this login page. And now I should be able to go to the login page, and I will see, hello, my name is, but we're not passing any props, so you won't actually see that. Login. So there it is. So there's our new component, right? This component creator is for Stencil, so it actually didn't put any Ionic components in there. So I'm going to copy some stuff from my app home just to do that, actually from my app profile. I'm going to take the header. Actually, let's do all of it. Let's do the header and the content. And we're going to paste it in here. It's got to be an array. And I don't want anything in the content except for like, this is content. Actually, we're going to add a button. So it's an Ion button. This is how so on click, if you're familiar with React, you have to do something like this as well. You can't just call a function in here. You actually have to bind it with this nice add arrow function. And then I can say this, like login with Google. And TypeScript, here's the benefit of TypeScript. It tells me that this doesn't exist yet, so I need to create this function. So up here, I can do that. And we'll say login, right? So there's my login page. Let's wait till this compiles. There we go. So if I log in with Google, I get my console. Let's zoom in on that too, so you guys can't see this whole time. I can log in, and it'll trigger that function. What I can do now is pass down with props on my login page. All I need is Firebase. So this might be a little different than you're used to with Angular, because Angular you'll have a service that then uses Firebase, and you call that service. It can be set up as a singleton, right? The way you create a singleton in React or in Stencil is you create it in the main app. At least this is one of the main ways, and then you pass it down via props. So any child component that wants to use that singleton will access it through the properties. Does that make sense? A singleton is basically a class that is used. You reference the data. You can reference the data from multiple places, but they're all referencing the same object or the same function set of functions. Alrighty, so we want to log in with Google, and the way we do that is through the Firebase auth functions. We've added a login route. Google, we did this. Here's our function. I'm going to copy this and then show you what it means. Firebase off, Google provider, Firebase. Okay. So
you have to explicitly pass it in, don't you, as an
I
attribute?
do. This will fail right now
Yeah.
because I actually haven't passed it Firebase. In fact, we could try that and we'll show you what will happen. Because it'll try to reference this .firebase and it is undefined, so it'll throw some kind of error, right? Can't read property off undefined. So then I have to go to my app, and on my login component, I can add. Oh, in fact, here's some TypeScript for you. I can't remember what they call this, right? Is it parameters? In fact, the V1 of the API was parameters, but it's now called component props. So component props is an object, and I can pass it any number of properties that I want to. Again, that's referencing this ion route component. So if I add component props, I can now add an object with Firebase as part of it. And Firebase is defined as a constant up here. Oh, I guess I imported Firebase. Yeah, so that works. So I am now passing Firebase down into my login component. Right? So now I have access to this Firebase and I should be able to do this stuff. This is basically how you can log in with, how you can use an auth provider with Firebase. You grab auth, you add a sign in with a pop-up, you have to pass in the provider. There's also other providers like Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, so that's another benefit of Firebase is you have multiple authentication methods. And then once they are authenticated, I can log that result or I can redirect them. In this case, I'm not going to redirect them because we're going to let our route actually handle that in a second.
Question for you.
Yeah.
And in past versions of Ionic, this works great, but when you build out an app, you got to install plugins and then call functions on the plugins for social login. But is this
Does this
work?
if you're working native?
Yeah, to build native.
There are some issues with native because what happens in this one is it does a redirect, so it's pushing it to a new view.
Mm-hmm.
And so for Swirkit, we've been trying to use the latest WK web view, but you can't add a tab or something like that. So we've been running into issues where we actually have to use the old version because of how Firebase is redirecting.
Mm-hmm. But it does work just using the
It does work just using this pop-up.
Sign in with pop-up. Okay.
Especially on web. I think the reason people use those other plugins is because you might have already permission from Facebook on the device, so that might be what the plugin actually does. Is it's using the native access to Facebook off, not like a web views access to Facebook.
Right.
So now if I log in with Google, it's going to pop up this Google auth, and I can select my Cory Swirkit, and I can log in. Right there's my user auth. So now I'm authenticated, but we haven't done anything with it yet. So I'm going to go to my app, and on route change we have this user, right? A cool thing you can do with Ionic Router or Ion Router is you can add Ion Route redirects. And I can go from, these are, you can pass like a wildcard in and say anything slash, anything that comes after the / to like the login page is maybe what I want to do. But this right now will always redirect to the login page, which is not what we want. We only want to redirect to the login page if they are not logged in. So I can actually just add a conditional in here and say if this .user redirect to the login page, else redirect to, or actually I think it's just undefined.
The other way around.
It should be the other way around.
Yes, it should be. Yeah. So basically, don't redirect unless they are. Don't redirect unless they aren't logged out. Does that make sense? I'm using all kinds of double negatives here. The other thing we want to have. Sorry, go ahead.
So that will redirect, even if even if I hit a valid route,
Yes.
redirect anyway.
Yes.
So that's just a check. Okay.
Yeah, so this is like an off guard,
Enforce.
right? So nobody can access my app unless they're logged in. So the other thing I want to do is, if they are on the login page and they are logged in, I want to redirect them to the app. So I can say from login, and if there is a user, I'm going to redirect them to the home page. Else, leave them on the login page, right? Undefined, right? So now I'm on the login page, right? I am authenticated. Google will persist my data as a cookie or something. I'm not sure how they do it with Firebase. And as I log out, do you see that? It actually redirected me to the home page. So because I'm authenticated. So if I again try to access the login page, it'll push me back to the home page as soon as it knows that I'm logged in. So that's cool. What's our time like? We got 15 minutes. Right? Is it 15 minutes or am I done? I'm done.
Yeah, wrap up 5 or 10.
I'll wrap up right now.
No.
For some reason I was thinking
Take
45
5 or
because it's
10.
45 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to just add my login, my log out function here, copy a few things. My log out function is somewhere basically Firebase. I could probably guess it. Let's just guess it. Firebase dot auth dot logout dot no, it's sign out. There it is. Okay, so there's our logout. So now if I'm on the home page and I log out, it'll also redirect me to the login page to log back in. So there we have it. I'm logged out. The last thing I want to do, which I think is worth showing, is you can disable that side menu, because I don't want anyone on the login page to like see these other pages. I don't want them to feel like they're inside the app. I can add this to the menu by adding this guy right here, disabled. So if I go to my Ion menu inside my split pane, I can add disabled if there is no user. That way, when I'm logged out, you'll see it'll go full page on the login screen. Wait for it. As soon as it compiles, full page on the login screen. And then as soon as I log in, it will redirect me and like I'm in the app now, right? So now I've got this authenticated app. I have an in the app experience. I have an out of the app experience. It's all through an off guard and awesomeness. So there you have it. Next time we could go over some actual Firebase stuff. Oh, I did say Firebase complex queries, so let me like at least show you one demo that I like the rest of this demo that actually does work. Just because this is really fascinating stuff that I just learned like last week or a couple weeks ago, but I've been trying to implement it in an app. So here's what we were going to build is like, hey, a list of phones that all come from my Firebase console here. So if I go into my database, I can see users, and the user that I am is Cory Swirkett, and I can see I pushed like a bunch of random data on here. But the cool here again is Firebase in its glory, because it's a readable, editable database that is all real time. So if I go to a phone that is like one of these phones, let's see if I can find one of these phones, or I could just add it. Let's do the other one. So the complex query part is here. So if I go to query Cory. So if I change Cory's phone, or if I add one. The cool thing that you can do with Firebase Firestore that you couldn't do with Firebase real-time database is that you can make complex queries. Like you can say, hey, I want you to return all of the data in this array or this collection that only has certain metadata. So in this query, I'm returning only phones that have the Cory metadata on them. So I can add that right now, like here, as a, metadata, as an object. And as part of that is this like value of Cory. And now that phone will show up on my list of 3. Right, so if you guys haven't seen Firebase before, this is where it gets cool. I can like change this name to Cory demo phone, right? And it updates in real time before I can even switch the tab, right? So anything that changes client side will update on someone else's client in real time. And you can do complex queries against hundreds of phones, but I'm only returning phones that have metadata that have Cory on them. So there's the last tag that I said I would do in the presentation.
Any join-like stuff in those queries?
So
It's
not really, no.
It's a NoSQL database.
Yeah, it's still a NoSQL database, but you can do queries that you couldn't before in Firebase. Before in Firebase, I would have to I'd filter them client side, which is really bad. So you'd
Sure.
get 100 down and say, oh, only show me the 4, right? Or you could do it through the REST API, but then it's not in real
So
time.
you can use
right?
some nice filtering.
You can do some nice filtering. So, and I'm also limiting this to only 10. So even though I have hundreds, I could say, hey, sort them by date and only show me the first 10, and I can pattern the results. Exactly.
There's like some best practices for like relationships and stuff that you can create in a collection so you can get the same for both effect. But
Yeah,
it's really cool. I mean, the real-time database is
yeah, it's pretty
like
awesome.
Chat apps are really easy.
awesome.
It eliminates the need for really a server-side anything.
Yep.
You just put it in the database.
Yep.
You can also write functions in the database too. That's a good thing you're doing. So you can do
Through Cloud Functions, you mean?
Bottom
yeah,
left
cloud
there.
functions.
Yeah, you're right. Yep. So you can like create your own API, and it acts kind of like Node does. Yeah, it's pretty awesome. There we have it. Any other questions since I went OT?
Did you find Stencil, is it more responsive than in just Ionic on its own?
Like Ionic
Is
3.
it more performant with the components?
Yes. One of the things that Stencil touts is everything's lazy loaded, and they compile them so that you have them in the right bundles that need to be together.
Yeah.
So you're not, for example, on one of my, and I'm currently building like 2 apps side by side with the same features. So I'll get back to you about how much more performant it is.
Yeah.
But something I noticed on my Angular app is every time I hit a page that is lazy loaded, like it takes a long time before it actually renders. What you can do with Stencil is you can say, hey, show me a skeleton screen, and then populate the rest of it. So there's ways that you can make it really, really fast.
You talk about the lazy load, are they just doing the whole picture or just the thumbnails?
So you can also lazy load images. What I'm talking about is lazy loading like components.
Okay.
So for example, even though in the current version of Ionic, you have to import the whole Ionic framework,
Right.
and you have that whole file that's somewhat loading your app, right? But if you don't use the Ion nav, that won't actually be compiled into your code. So it won't ever be loaded and won't ever slow down your users until they like actually launch an Ion nav, and that's when the JavaScript is fetched and things are rendered.
Okay.
If that makes sense. But yeah, there are components that actually help you lazy load images and thumbnails. So if it's off the page, it won't load until it's like in the view.
Well, and I guess for the components, I guess part of my question is there a thumbnail way to do it? Because I know thumbnails are a lot faster, but when you're using a component code,
Mm-hmm.
is there a condensed version that would load faster?
Well, that's kind of what Stencil is doing. It's basically saying, hey, their JavaScript only loads the minimal amount in order to like register the name my custom component, right? And as soon as the DOM sees my custom component, then it fetches the rest. So it's almost like that is your thumbnail, and their minimal little JavaScript just does enough to register and know which ones are custom components,
Okay.
which ones to look for, and then it fetches it when it needs it, right? So it's extremely fast. Thanks.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Cory.